at the Cantilever in Rainier. Our subject this evening is logging camps in northern Minnesota. Ashley's title, Logging Life, Camps, Community, and Challenges. But my name is Mike Williams. I'm president of the Couchiching County Historical Society, and to my left here I have Ashley Levine. She's our executive assistant, our executive director. And to her left is Corey Horton. She's the executive assistant. I want to thank the Cantilever for hosting this event. This is the second one this month that we had. And I want to have special thanks to Jeff McCard for his sound system. He's done every one that we've had here in Rainier the last 6 years or so. But most of all, I want to thank all of you for showing up on this cold evening. If you didn't come to these events, we wouldn't have them. So we appreciate it so very much. But this evening we'll be discussing logging camps beginning in the early 20th century all the way to their demise up here in the 1960s. We'll talk about their purpose, locations, a lot about their employees, and the daily life in the camps. But I'm going to start with probably the most important person in any logging operation, and that's the timber cruiser. Originally called timber estimators, their job was to physically enter the woods and estimate the volume of wood available for the market. This then would give investors an idea of what to bid for the right to harvest that wood. And the most noted of those early cruisers in this area was a man by the name of Lyman Warren Ayer. That's spelled A-Y-E-R. He was commissioned by E.W. Backus and Brooks Company, and arrived here in Borderland on the 14th of August, 1902. His report after several years of work must have made E.W. Backus smile. Backus then could go after the investors necessary for him to begin his empire. The forest product needed for the paper mills and sawmills would somehow have to be cut and then transported to the mills. There were few roads, no railroads at that time, and the only means of moving the logs to the market was the water route. So lumber camps necessary to house the thousands of men that were employed in the woods needed to be located as close as possible to streams, rivers, lakes. Landings were made on the banks where the wood could be moved by horse-drawn sleighs and then moved to log booms in the spring and eventually floated to the mills. Every few years, when the wood played out in a certain area, the camp would have to be moved. It could actually be moved as little as several miles, but once again, it had to be next to the water, next to that river or lake. But as railroads pushed north, as Backus's M&I did in 1907, logging camps then were located within short distance of the rail lines. It would take a few years, actually quite a few years, but with the growth of state and county roads and the use of trucks, the whole of northern Minnesota could now be logged. The reliance upon transportation, water transportation, ceased to exist, except for roadless areas like on our Kaptogama Peninsula. Today, the work of the timber cruiser is as important as ever. He or she has the help of modern technology as GPS, aerial, satellite imagery, but still must go into the woods to get an accurate inventory of actually what is really there. Their reports determine what bids, the amount of what bids will be put in for the harvest. And this hits close to home. My granddaughter Kathleen and her husband both are timber cruisers for the state of Wisconsin. Ashley?
So one of the biggest things after the timber cruisers come in and they establish where they're going to have the camps, and then the camps start getting constructed. The next logistical nightmare for these camps is going to be how are they going to get their supplies, especially in the early days. For the little camps, all of the individual camps that are operating privately, they have to figure it out entirely by themselves, whereas those that are operated by lumber companies, those lumber companies have warehouses that kind of deal with all of those logistics for them. So what were they doing in the early days? So most of those camps are located on rivers or very near a water source. So all of those supplies would be brought in on the river in the summertime or right after the river was opened, and they would bring in an entire winter's supply at one time. Although it sometimes would depend on the weight of those loads. They might have to make a couple of trips, because you're having to bring in food for over 100 plus people, plus all of the heavy equipment. So the types of foods that they're eating at this time, it's mostly dry goods, things like flour, beans, peas, oatmeal, prunes for sure. They definitely wanted those. Things that could be kept dry and stored easily for long periods of time. They were also having to haul in all of their bolts, their chains, their irons for sleighs, because they didn't have sleighs and stuff that were readily made. They were making those in the camps. So that all had to be transported. Another big logistic problem for them was the animals and the feed. So originally they started off with oxen. So oxen, they were easy to feed. They could survive pretty much just on hay. But the downside came later was that oxen weren't as strong as horses. So horses, pound for pound, could pull a lot heavier loads in the woods than an ox could. They were also a little bit more agreeable to work with typically than an ox. So because horses expend, it takes a lot more feed to make up for the caloric output that they're using, hauling all of this product. So then they were having to not only feed them hay, but they were having to haul in grain. So they had to get all of this feed out there for the animals as well. So they're not just feeding men, they're having to feed roughly 15 to 20 horses in a camp. And these horses are big. They're 1,800 to 2,500 pounds. And when you're feeding an animal that size, 3 to 5% of their body weight a day, that's a lot of food. So they also had packers that would come in and bring in random supplies. So these are guys that are just coming in with little backpacks, and they're carrying things like tobacco, tea, files, any of the lightweight stuff that didn't necessarily have to come in on a boat, or if their camp store runs out of stuff, they can do that. And those men are running those things on tote roads. So later on, roads are established by the timber cruisers that would end up somewhere like on a railroad spur point that they could have a drop-off, or they would have them meet them at the river, and then they would have teams of 4 to 6 horses that would haul in all of these supplies. Now, the camps that were located farther into the woods had to struggle a little bit more. That was where they had to, utilize these tote roads more, or a rail spur, or something like that to get the things delivered to them. Like I mentioned previously, the larger logging companies, they had warehouses or stores of their own located wherever they had a sawmill. So we had one in International Falls that was owned by the International Lumber Company. So that warehouse was the one that was responsible for organizing all of the distribution to the camps. Now, the families of the loggers that worked in those camps, if they lived in International Falls, they could also utilize those camp warehouses to get supplies for themselves while their husbands were out working. And I'll kind of talk about that a little bit later when we talk about camp stores and payroll. But that made life a lot easier for those people at the end of the day.
So I'm going to get into more of what the lumberjacks did in their free time. So we all know lumberjacks worked a lot, and they worked really hard. They worked 6 days a week from sun up till sundown. So they were always doing something, and they didn't have a lot of free time, but we're going to talk about what they did do when they had some free time. When they are not working, they were mostly eating or sleeping, and that's all I have to say. I'm just kidding. But they spent a lot of time eating. If they're not working, it was usually they're on their meals when they're not working, and they're sleeping in the bunkhouse. So all free time kind of centers around the bunkhouse. So bunkhouses were typically long barracks. Think of them as long barracks with bunk beds inside, they're usually 2 high. And they would usually have one large wood-burning stove in there to heat the entire bunkhouse. And imagine like clotheslines kind of running across from bunks and the ceilings for the jacks to be able to hang their clothes up after the day's work, so kind of dry their socks. There was pots of water there so they can kind of wash up after the end of the day or before dinner time. And it was very important that bunkhouses stayed clean. And the lumberjacks, they did their part. They kept up with their individual bunks. Other people were not allowed to touch their bunks. But it was the bull cooks who really did the duties of keeping things clean and orderly. So because lumberjacks work so hard, it was one of those systems where if you take care of them, they'll take care of you. So you want to maintain your lumberjacks and keep them happy, because then they put out more work during the day. So the bull cook would get them up in the morning. He'd go around and he would wake up the different crews at whatever times they need to be woken up at, which usually ranged between 5:30 and 6 a.m. Unless you had a specific job that you need to be up earlier than that. So the bull cook was up way to crack of dawn, getting people ready to go. And he was also who put them to bed essentially at night. He would do bed checks at 9 p.m., make sure everyone's in bed because they had a long day of work ahead of them, so they needed their sleep. He was also in charge of keeping the stove, full, keeping the fire tending to, and make sure that the bunkhouse was warm and comfortable. So if the bull cook was not having a good day, your bunkhouse might get a little chilly. So you always wanted to be sure you were nice to your bull cook. He was also in charge of cleaning and scrubbing the floors of the bunkhouse. And that wasn't an everyday chore, but they would do it every couple of days or at least once a week. You want to keep the dirt and grime out of there best you can, keep it swept out, because when the jacks are in there washing up and doing their small bits of laundry, they need clean spaces to put their stuff. And at the end of the day, when the jacks were done out of the woods, they'd come back to their bunkhouse. They would take their dirty clothes off, and they would use the wash bins that the bull cooks would set up to wash usually just their socks at the end of the day. Unless it was a particularly messy day, then they would wash other articles of clothing. But they always wanted to keep their socks clean because all of their clothes were wool, and clean wool is warmer than dirty wool. So they would get their socks cleaned up and hang them out to dry. They would also spend time mending their clothes if they needed to, sew up some holes, get some patches for their pants, things like that. It was also the time to sharpen and repair tools like your saws and stuff like that. And then just other chores, just daily chores, preparing yourself for the next day of work. So their life revolved around work. Every once in a while on a work day, there might be time to tell stories and maybe someone will pull out an instrument. But storytelling was their main mode of entertainment on a work day, on a work evening. But on Sundays where things got real crazy, they could wash all of their laundry on Sundays. Sundays, they had no work out in the woods, but that doesn't mean they weren't busy. They had a ton of chores to do. So they had the boiling up grounds on just about every logging camp. It was the area where they could fully boil their clothes, get things laundered, and then hang them up to dry in their bunkhouse. Sundays were also usually the day they would freshen up the hay in their bunks. It was important to keep the hay fresh to try and keep lice and things like that at bay. That was the thought. You don't want bed bugs or lice going around, especially when your clothes are wool. That would not be fun. And Sundays were also usually the day when the cooks would have special meals. And I say special because with air quotes, because sometimes it just meant that it was a more hearty meal, or the cook had more time and maybe there'd be a few extra dishes, or it would be the day that you have the fancy meats like pork chops instead of stews and stuff like that. And Sundays were when they had the most free time. So once they were done with their major chores, or if they were helping out, in other parts of the camp, getting things repaired, things built, animals tended to, they would play some games. Loggers had some interesting games. I'm going to talk about one of them. So card games were given. People would play poker, they'd play cribbage, except gambling was not big because cash was usually not kept in camps, because Jacks got paid at the end of the season, so they usually didn't have anything to gamble with unless it was like physical things, but they didn't have a lot of material possessions either. So they just played cards just to play cards. They would do a lot of games that would involve like feats of strength, like axe throwing or tossing the caber. If anyone's heard of that, that's an old Scottish game. You might have seen it like on TV where they get the big giant logs. They're like 8 feet tall, big round, and then they throw them as far as they can. So they would do that sometimes. Or they would play this game called Hot Ass. Read a story that I will regale you with. So Hot Ass is when they would all be together in the bunkhouse, and one gentleman would be chosen, and a bag would be placed over his head. He would have to bend over, and then someone else in the bunkhouse would spank him. You know how it is when you got a bunch of guys together in a bunkhouse. Things get real slappy real fast. So they would do that, and the person who was getting spanked would have to guess who spanked them, and if they guessed right, then that person, it was their turn to put the bag over their head and bend over. There was one particular case of this guy. He was sometimes known as the sheep herder, but he was more lovingly referred to as Fats. He was a very big man. He was over 6 feet tall, and the reason he was called Fats was just because he had a really wide bottom. And he didn't like to play these kinds of games, I guess. We can wonder why. But he got peer pressured into participating, and they were like, come on, spank the dude. They'll never know it's you because you never play. You never ever play. And so he's like, okay, spanks the guy, but he's super strong. The guy falls forward, and he immediately guesses it was Fats. No one else can hit that hard. So then poor Fats has to put the bag over his head and bend over. And they thought they were going to play a joke on him, and they took a board, like a wooden plank, and they used that to spank him, and the board broke over his backside, threw Fats into the bunk beds, crashed the bunk bed down, and then Fats didn't talk to them for the rest of the night. And I don't blame him, because that was really mean. But so that's kind of what Jacks did in their off time. Mail was not really a thing in the early days, for 2 reasons. One, because illiteracy rates were really high, and 2, the infrastructure just didn't exist in the early days of logging because the camps were so remote. In the later years, mail was no problem. Illiteracy rates were slightly better, but there were still people who, like camp clerks, would have to read letters to a lot of the Jacks because they didn't know how to read, and then they'd have to transcribe whatever they wanted to send off to their families. But that's pretty much what they did in their free time. They slept, they ate, and they spanked each other.
So if you were to have spoken to a lumberjack back in the early days and asked them what the best part of their day was, probably other than sleeping, it would have been eating. And that was the one thing that they demanded and required, was having good food in a camp. There was no better way to lose a lumberjack faster than to serve them really awful food. So they had no issue leaving a camp or a company if the cook was terrible or if the food was bad, because even the best cook in the world can't do much with bad food. So in the late 1870s to the early 1880s, the main staple diet of a lumberjack was primarily pea soup, sow belly, which was pickled salt pork, and beans. So I'm sure it's very filling. In the early days, they also didn't have any canned foods. Canned foods come much later. So all of the fruit, like apples, peaches, pears, you name it, prunes, it was all dried. Again, they're eating a lot of those dried foods, like the peas, the oatmeal. But they had a lot of fresh vegetables and things like that. Sometimes they would grow it in the camps themselves if they were going to stay in a camp for longer periods of time. They would have giant barrels of syrup, because flapjacks and things like that were mandatory for them. They had raging sweet tooths. The only fresh meat that was really available in the very early days, and I'm talking like, again, the 1880s to 1890s, was pretty much whatever was the local wildlife. So deer, caribou, moose, and they would trade with any local natives that were in the area. But then in the 1890s, the 1890s is like this revolutionary point for logging. They get canned food, there's a change in how they're keeping time. There's all kinds of stuff that happens. So canned food comes in, canned milk is the first big thing that they get. Then they start getting apples, tomatoes, things like that. You start seeing them having canned corned beef. They'll start bringing in quartered beef that they would keep in little frozen outbuildings for the winter months. And then some camps, again, like I said, that stayed several years, they would start raising their own livestock. So there was one camp that kept a lot of pigs every year. They would raise them through the summer and slaughter them in the fall. And then they would be able to have pork on Sundays, like their special meals. There was another gentleman, he was a lumberjack, he went out to Montana and he bought a bunch of sheep because he thought this was going to be a really good idea. And they bring all the sheep back and they kill them and they stack them up outside the cook shack like cordwood, and they feed these lumberjack mutton every single day. And guess what? Most of those lumberjack quit because they don't like mutton. So that was a lesson learned for them. By 1917 though, canned food is pretty prominent in most of the camps, so that makes the camp cook's job a lot easier, and the camps were happier for it. The one thing that they did keep on hand though at all times were the dried prunes. Because of the lumberjacks' diet, if they did not have prunes, those men probably would have hardly ever pooped. Prior to the First World War, most camps had about 100 men, and the kitchen could feasibly deal with that with just one camp cook, and then they would have maybe 3 or 4 cookies, and a cookie is the assistant cook, basically. But sometimes you would see a camp that might have over 200 men. This is extraordinarily rare, but if you did see a camp like that, they would have a ton of help. They would have a cook, they would have a meat cook, a pastry cook, a second cook, and then they would have a cookie for every 20 men for the camp. So there were a ton of hands in the kitchen all at once. So the saying, too many cooks in the kitchen, I feel like this would apply here sometimes. The cookies, though, they were really vital to the camp. They did so much in addition to what a normal cook would do. They were setting the tables, they're scrubbing the floors, they're having to wait on all of the tables, and then everybody, so all of the lumberjacks have place settings. There's a place setting that's very particular. The cups have to be a certain way, the plates have to be a certain way, and then for every 6 men, they have their little condiments. It's all like very just militant almost in the way that they're running the camp. The cooks would call for the lumberjacks with a 6-foot dinner horn. Some of the ones that were very good at it, the skilled cooks, they could play songs on the horns. If you were standing outside on a frosty winter morning or evening, you could hear multiple dinner horns around several camps if you were in, like if they were in a few mile radius of each other. So they were pretty good at it, and it was a very efficient way of getting the lumberjacks to come in. Another way of moving all of these men through the mess hall was that they had a very strict no talking rule. So these men had to file in, sit down, eat their food, not talk to each other, and it took about 12 minutes on average for a lumberjack to eat. And this, I feel like, would be my worst nightmare, is to just sit in a room for 12 minutes and just have nothing but mouth sounds, just listening to people eat. But it worked great because that was, like I said, a very efficient way of feeding, 100 plus people. The cookies, in addition to this, they had to wash all of the dishes, and I thought that this fact was really interesting. So they quickly figured out that the dishwashing was an extremely important process in the lumber camps because all of the dishes were tin. And because the dishes were tin, they were using copious amounts of soap to get all of the grease and grime and everything off. And sometimes people weren't rinsing them enough. I mean, you really had to rinse these dishes, I guess, a lot. And they didn't have towels to dry the dishes, so they're not wiping anything off. They would just stick the dishes into a white grain sack and just shake it. Shake it until the dishes are pretty mostly dry, and then put it in a tub on a stove and let it heat up and evaporate the rest of the moisture. Well, if they didn't rinse them well enough and they had grease or particles left on, and these lumberjacks ate off of them, they got violently ill. from both ends, and it was not good. And then those cookies ended up having to get fired because you have men that are out of work. And it was very easy to replace kitchen help, but it was not so easy to replace good lumberjacks sometimes. So they had a very particular, I thought that was just an interesting part of their job. The last important thing that they had to do was run the hot lunch program. And this was vital for the jacks that are out, in the cold all day. They demanded a hot lunch. They didn't carry a lunch pail with them. They didn't get coffee breaks. So when it got to be lunchtime, if you were over a mile from camp, your lunch was delivered to you in a sleigh, and that sleigh was called a swindingle. And it was designed specifically for bringing these meals. It had shelving in the sleigh, and it's fully padded and insulated. And so it would have these shelves that are set up for pies and kettles full of, roast beef and gravy and boiled potatoes and, almost anything you can think of that they're going to be having that day. And they have to get it from the kitchen to the men within 20 minutes. So they're cooking down the trail to get, to these people. And the only thing that's fixed at the campsite or, at their little lunch spot is just coffee and tea for them to drink. And the horses also get to have a little lunch break. They would drive the horses into a little adjoining area, and they're probably sweaty, and obviously they're going to be hungry. So the horses all get blanketed so they don't get sick or have any muscle issues. They make sure that they get some hay, a little bit of feed if they can, and if it's a possibility to water them, they would do that at that time as well. So everybody gets a lunch break, everybody's happy and full, and that's feeding the jacks.
The other thing jacks did was get hurt. The lumber industry is dangerous. Logging is a dangerous profession. So what was the healthcare situation like for lumberjacks? Well, for the really early lumberjacks, it sucked. They were kind of SOL. First aid kits did not exist in any lumber camps until after 1919. They were not mandatory, and they were kind of just bring your own medical kit if you want to. If you don't, then I guess you'll just die. But it wasn't too bad. Reading firsthand accounts, it sounds like in the early days of logging, the old loggers, they were really careful, and whether that was just because they took pride in their work and they wanted to work hard and show their bosses that they knew what they were doing, or they knew that if they got hurt, they didn't have a job anymore. There was no, workman's comp. They weren't guaranteed a spot at camp if they got seriously injured, and it looked bad on your record if you had an injury that was considered lost time injury, if you were costing the camp time and labor. So early medical care was basic. If you got a cut, you would use some pitch from the trees or some sap to kind of plug your wounds, or you would take some of your chewing tobacco, chew that up, and use it like as a salve. There was some medicine available in the camp stores that was more of just like liniments and Vaseline. Liniments don't really do anything. It's, you drink them and hope for the best. Vaseline can only do so much. They had a ton of medicine for horses, though, because horses were more expensive than men and people. So if the horses got sick, there was no problem. They could fix a horse right away. But if you're a dude out there, no, you better hope your wife or someone sent you some good medicine, because you weren't getting anything. But later on, things got better, and the camp stores were stocked with actual first aid kits, and the camp clerks would help do like little nurse duties. But it was still kind of like on your own. But around 1888, there was hospitals starting to be built in like Duluth. So like, what's it called? The Sisters of St. Benedict's built St. Mary's Hospital in Duluth. And so started a rudimentary form of organized healthcare. And some larger camps had like their own hospitals, but otherwise these third-party hospitals would send people out into the camps, and in the case of St. Benedict's and St. Mary's, they would send a nun. And this nun that would go around and travel to all of the logging camps, her name was Sister Amata, and she would go around selling hospital tickets to the lumberjacks. What the hospital tickets were was essentially health insurance. They would pay anywhere from $1 to $5 to be covered for a whole year, and they could go get medical treatment at any of the participating hospitals in the area. So St. Mary's in Duluth serviced a lot of the camps that would have been in this area in northern Minnesota. There was also hospitals at Cass Lake, Brainerd, Bemidji, Crookston, and Grand Rapids. So kind of whatever hospital was closest to you is where you would go. And in the smaller hospitals that were owned by logging companies, they were more resting homes, essentially. If you got hurt, you sprained ankle, for example, you could go there, you'd have a bed and a hot meal, and some local ladies would kind of just take care of you. They weren't nurses, they were just ladies that getting paid to make sure you weren't dying. But if your injuries were really severe, like, I don't know, losing your arm, I read about that. Some guy got his arm sliced clean off in a logging accident. He got sent to a proper hospital because the resting home didn't have the equipment for that. So there was a few different levels of care they could receive. But this is kind of how it worked for the most part until 1913, when Minnesota passed their working men's compensation laws. And so then the hospital tickets kind of became a thing of the past. Sister Amata didn't have to go around to the camps anymore, which was kind of unfortunate because she was always a welcome visitor at a lot of the logging camps because she was nice and funny, and the Jacks liked seeing her. But yeah, 1913 was when workman's comp came in, and if you got hurt, it wasn't as detrimental to your career anymore.
The last thing that I have for you guys is about the camp store and the camp clerk. And this job was probably one of the most important, at least for getting paid and monitoring, the things in the store and how lumberjacks were able to get anything that they needed if they ran out of clothes or if they needed new socks or snuff or mail or whatever it is that they wanted. But prior to the 1890s, the camp foreman was the one who was primarily responsible for keeping track of men's times, and they would just mark it on a calendar, or they would keep it up in their head, because there really wasn't a whole lot to it. I mean, it was basically you marked down when the guy started and then when the camp broke. Tobacco and snuff were free from the companies at that time, along with a lot of other things. And then by the 1890s, once the 1890s hit, again, it's a revolutionary time period for logging companies, they decided that they weren't going to give things for free anymore. They were going to start charging the lumberjacks for their tobacco, for their snuff, if they needed clothing or whatever else in the store. And they wanted, so having to do that meant that the foremen were going to have to keep track of those things. And lo and behold, these foremen can't read and they can't write. So that means that somebody else has to be hired to do that job. So then that's when the camp clerk came in. And these positions were usually young men. They would just come in and maybe work for a year or two, but some of them made a career out of it because it didn't pay terribly. And so their job was to do all of the record keeping. They would order supplies for the cook, they would order parts and equipment for the blacksmiths, for the handymen, whatever was needed by the camp, the clerk made sure that it was there. And the area of the camp office that he was located in, that the store was, it was just a little corner of the office, and they called it the Wanigan, or they would refer to it as the bullpen. And I guess they probably called it the bullpen because all the guys coming in and congregating in this one little area, I don't know, so that's the name they gave it. But the clerk was the only person that had the key, had access to this store, despite there being a lot of other men that are working in the camp office, like the foreman, the checker, the scaler, all these other dudes in there. So in the larger camps, these clerks, again, spending most of their day doing the bookwork, ordering the supplies. If they were lucky later on, they might have a camp telephone, so they'd be doing that. But then when the Jacks came in the evening time, he was working from about 6 until 9, handing out stuff that they were requesting or needing. Again, this snuff, tobacco, mail, socks, whatever it is they wanted. Now, some Jacks did have some cash on them occasionally, so they could pay with cash, but 99.9% of the time they were using charge accounts, and that was just being added to their ledger. So when they were paid out at the end of the season, some got paid out at the end of the month. It just depended on the company that they were working for or whatever their job was. So it was just, their ledger was just a bunch of balance or a bunch of debits and credits to their account. By 1915, though, lumber companies decided, somebody somewhere in an office thought, how can we make this guy's job suck more? So they wanted to make decisions on, or figure out how they could make logging more cost conscious. They wanted to figure out what part of logging was expensive, or what was taking up too much money, why were things taking so much time. So this camp clerk, this poor, probably some kid that's 17, sitting in an office crunching numbers, he now has to go out to these camp foremen or who's ever running a certain job and ask him, excuse me, sir, why is this taking your men so long to do this job? Because it's costing us a lot of money and you need to hurry up. So this generated a lot of paperwork and issue for these camp clerks on top of everything else. Then when the first aid kits are introduced, they have to become a nurse. And so they're also responsible for that. When the payroll happened, so like I mentioned before, lumberjacks could get paid out at the end of the month, but mostly they were paid out at the end of the season. So they would get these checks and they could either cash them in town at the company stores, or they could cash them in any town that they were close to. A lot of these lumber companies would have arrangements with hotels or banks or local business owners. There was one instance that happened in Mizpah where there was a local business there who cashed over $10,000 worth of company checks for a logging company called Ross and Ross. And when he went to go collect on those company checks, he found out that Ross and Ross actually went bankrupt and they had no money to pay him. And so he was out $10,000, and I think he ended up losing his business, or he was very close to losing his business. So by having those arrangements, it was definitely not without risk. And so some of the loggers that had families, though, they could get money periodically throughout the year if they needed it. Otherwise, they would just have to wait until spring. They could go to those company warehouses and they could get supplies on credit. So then it was just deducted from the lumberjack's pay throughout the season. And then whatever his final paycheck was after, his wife or whoever had gotten groceries or clothes or whatever they needed from the store, that would just be with what he was left with at the end. But that was how their payroll went.
Often the question is asked, were there women in the camps? The answer to that is mostly no. However, some camps allowed wives and even the children to do kitchen work. But my parents were married in December 1931 and were hired by Henry Keyes to work in his logging camp. That one was located in the southeast corner of our Kempton Channel here on Rennie Lake. My mom worked in the kitchen while my dad worked in the woods. But they were there just one winter with a child on the way. But I have an experience with a family actually working with the man of the house at a logging camp. Alfred Johnson had a logging camp in Becky's Bay, which is several miles west of Kettle Falls in the 1950s, 1960s. The camp cook had his wife and young son with him. And I think those were the summers of 57 and 58. And they had a boy that was my age, and one of the guides at Kettle Falls, Slim Davis, and then my dad would boat me down there, and I would spend day after day playing, with the boy there. But one thing that I really remember is that I don't know who the baker was, whether it was the man or the wife, but they made the best raised donuts that you ever could imagine. But Ashley and Corey do have several photos over here in their display of camps that have women in them. But another question that's commonly asked is, what happened to the logging camps when they were no longer needed? the answer is if they were made of logs, they were simply abandoned. They would rot away unless they were burned by the frequent fires that happened in those days. But if made of lumber, like those with the VRNL on the Upper Lakes, they were dismantled and moved to another location and rebuilt. Of course, the root cellar remained, and the outhouse remained, and quite often one small building. And there are stories of retired lumberjacks moving into these camps and spending their final days. I know of two in the Kettle Falls area, and if we have time later, I can talk about that. But why don't we see lumber camps today? The answer is actually quite simple. More and better roads and mechanization. Now one man can do the work of dozens. The logging trucks can move the lumber to market even on the day that it is cut. So no longer men do have to sleep in remote camps. They can live at home with their families and still get the job done. But in closing, I'd like to talk about one of the things I've always enjoyed, and that is exploring old logging camps on the Kaptogama Peninsula. My favorite ones are the Shevlin Clark camp. This one happens to be in Canada, in Hale Bay, on the east end of Hale Bay. And the other one, a large camp, located on Weir Lake, just off of Mica Bay on Namakan Lake. But I found the location of both of bunkhouses, horse barns, many small buildings, root cellars, outhouse, obviously, and then garbage dumps. But I've also found chains, horseshoes, scrap metal, and one time in Weir Lake, and it's still there, a stack of incredibly long two-man crosscut saws welded together with rust. And a few years ago, I used a metal detector and explored one of the Shevlin Clark camp in the bottom of Hale Bay, but all I found were nails and some scrap iron, tin cans. But in my flying years, I discovered quite a few sites, from the air. Have yet to explore them. Those sites were relatively easy to spot from the air because of the outline of the old buildings. The buildings for insulation were banked with earth. And after everything rotted away, only those berms remain. And the time to see them is in the early spring, right after the snow leaves and before the vegetation comes up. But I should add that Forest History Center in Grand Rapids is an excellent place to learn of our logging past. They have a replica there of a 1900 logging camp. And when the Virginia and Rainy Lake Lumber Company closed their Minnesota operation in 1929, they left everything intact on their Camp 29, which is located in Hoist Bay on Namakan Lake. Resort took over the camp after it was left, modernized the buildings, but it still is a really, really interesting place to visit. And the park has done an excellent job in preserving it. But at this point in time, we will take questions.
Is there a map of where all the previous locations were?
Well, there's a question, is there a map of all where these camps were? The only map that I know of is in the library at Voyageurs National Park. And that's a map of all the camps that were within Voyageurs. The rest of the state, these camps only existed in a certain location for a year or two.
But there is one around Voyageurs.
In Voyageurs, yes. Yeah, and they also, they go into detail, they have actually got the board feet of lumber that was moved through that camp.
What was the life expectancy of a lumberjack back then?
The life expectancy, lumberjack?
So
Ashley or Corey could probably answer that.
it was good. A lot of lumberjacks live to be old. I mean, the life expectancy, depending on the year, like the life expectancy of 1888, the variance between like a normal person doing a normal job and a lumberjack doing their job, it didn't differ all that much. Because they, you know, there were accidents, of course, and people did die in accidents, especially like the river pig, so people logging on rivers and floating logs down the river. A few people drowned, you know, obviously you're gonna have accidents, but the general life expectancy, it was fairly average for the average person, because there's a lot of old jacks in camps, because it was also very important for old lumberjacks to be taken care of, because once you're a lumberjack, you're always a lumberjack. And so as they aged and got older, they would give them different jobs that suited their new abilities and mobility needs. So old lumberjacks were a common sight. So I can't give you like a age, you know, of life expectancy, but it really wasn't all too much different, and old lumberjacks were well taken care of in camps. They always had jobs.
We have pictures of lumberjacks that are probably in their late 60s, 70s that are still in the camps that are doing some type of work.
Yeah.
But yeah, we have photos with lumber crews with much older gentlemen in the photos.
Yeah, so unless they're just dying on accident and like tragic accidents, it was pretty normal.
Yes, thank you all
Yeah,
for coming
thank
out.
you.
We appreciate it.
Thanks to everybody.